Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator from Arab News, Frank Kane, and his guests.
Thank you, and good morning, Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen. I'd like to welcome the esteemed panelists up onto stage now, please. If I could ask Mohammed Al-Tuwaijri, Minister of Economy and Planning, Saudi Arabia. Kirill Dmitrie, Chief Executive Officer of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. Darren Davis, Chief Executive Officer of Madina of Saudi Arabia. And Bassam Abdallah, Chief Executive Officer of Toma Advisory from the UAE. Thanks, Bassam. Hi. Thank you, gentlemen. Well, we're here to discuss one of the most important issues which faces the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia at the moment. We're here to answer the question, which economic model for privatization will prevail? And privatization is one of those concepts which has gathered pace and steam, but it's a relatively young idea, actually, and only in the last 50 years or so have we seen the real concept of privatization come to the fore. It was a reaction in the 1970s to the slow 20th century encroachment of state ownership and control. Margaret Thatcher, who many of you here will remember, was the pioneer in Britain of the modern privatization movement. And then there were lots of others in Eastern Europe, in South America, until in the 1990s, the biggest privatization wave in history, the de-Sovietization of Russia and the former Soviet republics, which, as I say, the biggest privatization in history hitherto, because Saudi Arabia might just challenge that particular fact. Slowly, behind the scenes, in Asia, China had been undergoing its own form of privatization, a rather more discrete form, whereby state ownership was relaxed in various parts of the economy, but still under central state control. And now there are many models of privatization, but the Middle East has always had its own particular kind of quasi-state, quasi-private ownership models, which persist to this day and which now present countries in the GCC with a whole range of options to choose as they look to reduce the influence and role of central governments. And this is Saudi Arabia's vision and Saudi Arabia's challenge to reduce still further the role that the government plays in private enterprise and business, and how best to do this. These are the issues that we will discuss today with these experts. And I want to ask, first of all, to give your overall thoughts on the central question: which economic model will privatization take in Saudi Arabia? And Minister, Your Excellency, if I could ask you first to give me a brief overview of that. Thank you.
Sure. I think the ultimate model is what investors really want at this point of time. However, that's also goes in line with learning from best practice and previous experiences. Here in Saudi Arabia, when we looked at our own model, we literally mapped the whole world, both historically and geographically. So there is the bad, there is the good, there is the ugly experiences in the past. So we look at it from what investors really want. And to start with, they actually like to see a stable macro economy. They like to see growth in the future. They like to see labor markets will develop. They like to see capital markets accessible. They like to see transparency. They like to see fairness in the process. They like actually to see quality assets that the government is committed to. So these are the big guidelines we're adopting here in Saudi Arabia. And this is the starting point of any privatization that's going to take place in the future. Just to give you a couple of examples, in Saudi Arabia, we have established a dedicated center of excellence to be the focal and central point of contact with customers, to manage the pipeline of opportunities, to be the governance to all government entities in terms of execution of those opportunities that we have. We've also aligned ourselves with all government entities and all Vision 2030 programs to make sure that in terms of execution and time to market, we are also aligned. Example, housing. Saudi Arabia is in the process of building around 500,000 units. So what does that mean for our electricity? What does that mean for our water? And both entities are in the process of privatization. So we need to have this alignment so not only the government benefits and optimize value, but also the investors who's going into this process can see this future value and discount it to its current value today in terms of valuation these opportunities.
Thank you, Minister. That's a very good introduction. Kirill, from a very different starting point, I guess that you were around and growing up and being educated during the big wave of privatization in the 90s. Yep. How do you think that's worked out for Russia? And also, please, have a go at the question, which economic model is best?
Sure. Well, privatization really is at the heart of, actually my thinking about some of the investment issues, because in the Soviet Union, 100% of everything belonged to the state. And we went through this painful privatization experience, which we believe at the end was a success, because now lots of successful private businesses emerged from those privatized entities. But definitely there was lots of debate about fairness and openness and competitive nature of the process. And I think those are all the considerations that need to be taken into account. Actually, my thesis in university was about which privatization model works best. And we did some statistics and mathematics. I cannot repeat now because I forgot all of it, but all I remember was that the competitive model works best. So we actually showed statistically that if you have an open competitive privatization process, then it leads to much more restructuring after privatization, to much more investment after privatization, and frankly to a better and more efficient ownership after privatization. So we believe this issue of competitive process, opening opportunities to many investors is important, but then obviously then thinking needs to be about, do you allow other countries' sovereign wealth funds, for example, to participate in privatizations? Do you limit their share of privatized companies? How do you ensure good corporate governance of privatized entities? And one of the issues, for example, in Russia is that some state-owned companies are very efficient and management is focused on creating value. But then some other state companies, they don't see value in market capitalizations, they don't see value in dividends. So how do you ensure that management, because you could have privatizations where government still retains control, that management of that entity is focused on minority shareholder growth of value, etc. So many issues, and definitely Russian privatization experience has some important lessons to be thought about.
Okay, thank you. Bassem, you had experience in Jordan during the privatization wave there. Give us your view, if you would.
Echoing what was mentioned by their excellencies in terms of the different models, privatization does need to address a number of issues. It addresses not only funding, but it addresses efficient management, and it addresses ways for developing companies and institutions. It is very healthy to have different models of privatization, because countries need to develop their tailor-made solutions based on countries, on the individual countries, but also based on sectors, because different sectors also require different models of privatization. There is no one model that fits all. And I think looking back at experiences, whether in the developed world or in the developing world, some of them are good and some of them are not so good, and learning from past examples, I think it is important to understand that if you're looking at a sector, whether it is telecommunications or energy or agriculture or water, utilities, it is extremely important for the sector to be ready. It has to be properly restructured to allow for the private sector to enter in order for the private sector to enjoy the kind of things which were mentioned, the transparency, the fair competition, the ability to have a level playing field among different areas. You have to build institutions, if they are not there, for regulations. So the regulatory authorities have to be in place in order to ensure the competition among the different parties and to ensure that the government, the public sector, which has until now played the dominant role, become another player, only another player. So if I'm in the private sector and I'm an investor, my big concern would be how do I actually compete against the government, and will there be enough checks and balances and enough regulations in order to ensure that the government will only play as another investor or only limits its role to being a regulator and not actually a player in the market. I think these are areas that need to be contemplated when you look at the Saudi Arabian example, because it's going to be, as you said, one of the biggest privatization models in history, and it needs to be done based on past examples, to learn from the errors of the past and to address the issues that really make a difference. One last point. I think it is very important to explain to people what privatization is all about. I think one of the biggest mistakes made in many countries before in the developing world was we took it for granted that people would understand what you would say, that people readily understand that privatization is a good thing because it enhances efficiency, it brings capital, it brings technology, it addresses the issues of better management. You need to explain that. People need to understand that this is not just another transfer of capital from the public sector to private sector. And in many developing countries, unfortunately, the example was a transfer from public sector to what is referred to as crony capitalism. So there was a lot of talk and a lot of rumors about corruption and about lack of transparency and so forth. And I think the more open and the more transparent the governments are in terms of addressing these issues and explaining to people why we need to privatize and why privatization is important and how it will enhance the economy and how it will actually improve the performance of the company, I think that's really something that needs to be addressed and not to be just underestimated. Thank you.
Lots of interesting issues there, which we'll come back to. Darren, I guess you could almost be regarded as work in progress, can't you? Because you are, Madin was 50% owned by the Public Investment Fund, now 65%, and you could argue that will lead to a greater listing of shares at some stage. So how does it feel to be, with a government company, but also with a large listed shareholding?
I think the Madin case is an interesting example of the fact that privatization doesn't come in one size. I think you need to be flexible in how you apply privatization and about what you mean by privatization. I mean, I grew up in the 80s in the UK, and privatization there was about monetizing assets for the government to fix a fiscal problem. It was about efficiency, improving services, bringing down costs, and with some caveats that was largely achieved those aims. And then privatization became about getting the private sector to do things that the government used to do, provide services, provide utilities, etc. I think Madin is an interesting example because I think it shows you where the government can actually play a role in growth, but with the private sector, so kind of a private-public partnership. So we began 10 years ago, really, when the government gave us around $1 billion, but then listed the company, but kept the shareholding. And that did a couple of things. In a sector which didn't exist in Saudi Arabia at the time, so it wasn't about monetizing anything, it was about enabling a sector, but allowing the private sector to do that for the government. And so two things came from that government ownership. First of all, by maintaining a significant stake in the company. A very new company with a small capital base was able to raise a lot of capital from the private sector, whether it be the equity capital markets or debt capital markets, that it would not otherwise have been able to do on its own, and therefore grow at a rate that would have been impossible as a purely private sector entity. And secondly, by maintaining the shareholding, the government benefited from the upside. So as the company has grown and expanded and continues to grow, the government's actually benefited from that growth of the private sector led. I mean, to answer your specific question about what the government's shareholding would be in the future, I think His Excellency Ar-Rumayyan on the first day talked about PIF as a very different entity than it was when we were first founded. So I'm sure they'll look at that over the coming years as part of their portfolio. But we certainly think we have a lot more to give to the PIF in the coming years. There's a lot more growth to come from Madden.
Right, you seem to think that state owner or some form of state ownership has actually been rather beneficial.
I think the differentiation is there's a difference between government ownership and government management. So having the government ownership was very beneficial, but it was never a government-managed company. And I think that getting that balance correct is the right thing. Governments tend not to be fantastic at managing private sector or ideally private sector-led industries. So I think the way the government retained itself as a shareholder but not a manager was the secret to that success.
Okay. Minister, at the Ministry of Economics and Planning, you are at the sharp end of this. Can you tell us a bit more about the process and the timing issues, the pipeline, those kind of things?
Sure. I think, again, I echo everything that's been said. There is a lot of effort to educate the system around the benefits of privatization, what it means, what's the end finish line. So we're doing a lot of that in terms of bringing up the expectation to start with and the level of engagement within government entities around private. Second, we're actually finding out that the more governance you have around transparency and having an independent working teams, hiring the right advisors, engaging with global institutions who advise on those transactions, the better. So we're doing also a lot of that in the ministry and in the privatization center. So between education, trying to learn from best standard and best global standards, I think the privatization process is undergoing. In terms of pipeline, it is sector by sector. So I echo Basim's point on readiness. So some sectors naturally, because of the Saudi investments historically in infrastructure, are more ready than others. Between now and the first quarter of 2019, we're going to introduce 4 opportunities in silos and grains, which is under the Ministry of Environment. We're also going to introduce some assets for education, schools. We're also going to introduce a couple of assets in healthcare, a major institution and some of the services of healthcare, and also some desalination plants. Again, because of the historical investments in those assets and the readiness and the phase where they are now and the investor appetite, funding, etc., is all in good place. I think this will be the first tranche.
Okay, so silos, grains, healthcare, desalinization, that's more or less your list of priorities, is it?
Absolutely.
Okay, and first quarter of next year?
Between now and first quarter next year, yes.
All right. Some observers have been a little disappointed, I guess, at the slow rate of privatization, of state sell-off. What's your answer to that?
Well, I would argue market conditions, and I started my comments by investors and investors' appetite. In Saudi Arabia, we needed to bring in the growth of the economy back into sustainable growth. In Saudi Arabia, we needed to make sure the underlying legal infrastructure, writing the laws, PPP law, PSP, bankruptcy law, are in place, and this is all behind us now. We also wanted to make sure the labor market policies, there is a massive HR challenge in privatization. We also needed to align our labor market policies into the privatization process. This is also behind us now. And also, I mentioned the alignment with other Vision 2030 program. We need the system to mature a little bit. And we make sure that the capital markets, for example, inclusion in the MSCI, FTSE, the debt management office, establishing a yield curve, all these were prerequisites for privatization to take place. Can we press a button on some of these opportunities today? The answer is yes. Are we optimal by pressing the button now? Maybe not. So the question is, how do you strike the balance between time to market, introduce those opportunities to the private sector, and maximizing value, not only monetary value, but also social value and efficiency value.
Okay, okay. Tell me, do you think from a kind of social and cultural point of view that Saudi investors understand privatization, you know, that they are ready for it? What's the man in the street's perception of state sales?
Again, history in Saudi Arabia, privatization goes back to the 1970s. Saudi Telecom, electricity, Ma'aden, NCB, and many others. I think our private sector is mature enough, strong enough to understand privatization, but it's also the whole world who's interested. This is not only the Saudi private sector. We have a lot of interest from European companies, Asian companies into our process and assets. So that's important. Second, I think the scale of this program is significant, and it deserves to take all effort, all attention in terms of preparing the infrastructure and preparing the ecosystem for the private sector to engage with this program.
In terms of scale, there was a figure quite early on of something like $200 billion worth of state sell-off, apart from Aramco. Is that still the figure?
So again, here we look at whether we include the PIF assets within that figure or not. Do we include the opportunity discovery, which is not today immediately in the program? We're talking to some of the government entities, the payment systems in SAMA, some of the assets the Ministry of Finance hold, etc. These are also ongoing opportunities that may be very attractive to private sectors because of their cash flow position and attractiveness and steady growth, and also of their operation.
Okay.
So, yeah, the figure could vary, but also the market ultimately will decide.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But it seems as though the 200 billion figure is still achievable, depending on what you include in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Kirill, from a Russian point of view, you deal with Saudi investors all the time. What kind of exits do you see for current state-owned companies with whom you do business? Do you think that they're looking towards IPOs, towards trade sales, towards some kind of public-private partnership? What do you get as their choice of these options?
Yeah, I think obviously it depends on the company and on the sector, and I'm glad that Minister mentioned lots of opportunities in agricultural infrastructure sector. And we have our Deputy Minister of Agriculture here, and we are quite keen to also participate in privatizations that will be happening in the agriculture infrastructure sector of Saudi Arabia, because we believe there is a huge opportunity between Russia and Saudi Arabian agriculture. But what we've seen is, for example, you know, in Russia, some of it was done through IPO. So we privatized our largest diamond company, Alrosa, one of the top in the world, through IPO, and it got a pretty diversified shareholder base. And that was a way to do it because, again, Alrosa, we wanted to make sure that lots of funds from all over the world participate in this. In other opportunities, we are focused much more on private-public partnership. And we believe that, by the way, the role of public-private partnership will grow dramatically. And many people don't view it necessarily as a privatization, but frankly it is, because we are talking about hospitals being done through private-public partnerships, toll roads, airports, ports, and I think that is also a very important segment, and we believe that Saudi Arabia is looking at those private-public partnerships very carefully. And then finally, you mentioned sometimes there is a role for a strategic player with some core skills, either from Saudi Arabia or from other countries, that can bring lots of value. And we've seen, for example, we are bringing Veolia, which is a top infrastructure player from France, into some privatizations in Russia, and we sometimes focus on top airport operators to bring them, like Changi, we brought to Vladivostok Airport in Russia. So sometimes it's good to go for a core partner that can bring lots of value, and it depends on the situation. I'm sure the government of Saudi Arabia will be carefully thinking which form to do for each of the entities.
Right, okay. Bassem, the same question really, which is best, IPO, PPP, trade sales, strategic investors?
Well, it depends on the context. Obviously, privatization needs to take place in the context. And in the example of Saudi Arabia that we are living nowadays, I think it's important to remember that privatization is one out of several pillars that make the vision of 2030, that make the transformation plan. So the transformation plan and the vision of 2030 is made up of different policies and different actions. Privatization is one of them. And it depends on the success also of other things going on in the economy. What is going on in the economy right now is a diversification from a monolithic example, a monolithic model, into a diversified economy. And that is allowing new sectors of the economy, particularly in ICT, in entertainment, in tourism, in services, to come in and to make sure that they provide for a contribution, a healthy contribution in the GDP. That's one. But the other thing that is also going on in Saudi Arabia is also a change in the private sector, because the private sector of Saudi Arabia, as has always been the case since at least the 60s or the 70s, where some of them have been pioneering, but most of them have actually been participating as sort of beneficiaries of public sector expenditure rather than as investors. So what you're having right now is a real shift for the private sector and also for Saudi savers to become investors into actual opportunities that will transpire in the next few years as a result of the privatization model. And also I would add that the new economy as it is emerging, whether it is in ICT and the advancement of technology as we are witnessing it, but also in terms of the development of SMEs. SMEs provide and contribute a lot for economies in the emerging countries, particularly in Saudi Arabia, but also in other areas of the Middle East. And I think this is a context, this is part of the context that I'm talking about. What is happening in Saudi Arabia is also a shift into more SMEs and more startups and more technology-based companies. Obviously, once the grandiose giga projects are actually realized, whether in NEOM or elsewhere, that will also provide ample opportunity for technology to be able to be the main contributor of economic advancement in the country. So what I'm saying is privatization should not be looked at on its own. It is part of a context that is taking place in Saudi Arabia rapidly, but it's taking place in parallel at the same time in order to make sure that the economic growth is actually happening in the way that is foreseen in the Vision 2030 plan.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's, I will come back to you, Minister, in a moment about how you align it with Vision 2030. I think that's quite crucial. But Darren, you have your major shareholder, 65% owner, the Public Investment Fund. If that were to reduce, I guess there are a number of options, and these are the kind of things that we've been hearing about now. Which would be your preference? Would it be a further sell down in the market, some form of trade sale? Which do you think would be best from a corporate point of view?
I can't answer for the PIF, to be honest.
No, from the point of view of Madin.
I think it's not that simple. I think the future of Madin is, it's difficult to map out here. I could spend an hour talking about the strategic direction we're going, and we have an enormous suite of opportunities that come from Vision 2030, and not just in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but beyond the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So the way Madin will evolve in the coming 2 to 3 years will substantially change the nature of the company, both in terms of its scope and its size. And I think in terms of, from an investor's point of view, how they see Madden will probably change over that period of time as well. So I think there's not a right answer at the moment. We have a very active dialogue with the PIF, and I think it's a very healthy dialogue. They treat us, it's like talking to BlackRock when you talk to the PIF. They're interested in what you're doing, but they're interested in the returns. They're obviously also interested in the returns to the kingdom in terms of GDP and jobs, but they talk to us as an investor. So we talk to them regularly. We have very good ideas that we share between them. So there's a number of different options, and it's certainly not, we don't have a particular view on some of the points you just made in terms of strategic investors, etc. I think some of those, each of those could be right in the right circumstance, but it will depend on what we do in the next 2 to 3 years.
But have you found it comfortable to deal with public shareholders? Would you like more of them, I guess is the question.
The market here is unusual. It's a very retail-driven market. So the interaction is harder in some ways. You know, when you're mostly institutions holding shares, it's much easier to interact with those because they're sophisticated, they know what to ask. You know, the dialogue's very straightforward. With the public shareholders in the kingdom, you know, you have to make a lot more efforts to,
with the retail
communicate, because most of the shareholders are retail.
Okay.
So you need to make sure your communications are very good, and obviously their level of sophistication isn't always as high as an institution. So you need to make sure they understand what your long-term vision is, particularly with a company like Madden, where it's a growth story. So it's not a short-term Twitter-led story. We really need to sell to our shareholders why they should be shareholders in the long term for Madden. And so it's quite different having public shareholders in the kingdom.
Okay, right. Minister, you highlighted the need to align privatization with Vision 2030. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because Saudi Arabia is still an energy revenue-driven economy and will continue to be so for a long time. And that's public sector. Well, until 2030, there will still be a majority driven by oil revenue. So how far can privatization go in the kingdom? You know, how do you align your program of state sales with Vision 2030?
So I just mentioned the housing program and how that alignment is critical, but I'll mention a few other programs. His Excellency Al-Jad'an talked before this session about the fiscal balance program. And from an investor point of view, again, having a sustainable balance sheet is crucial to success of any privatization program. Development of the capital markets program means that the investor will have access to capital, they can securitize, they can exit, you know, whenever they want in terms of the system ability to accommodate for capital markets instruments. NIDLIB, which is a major industrial and local content program that will drive export, diversify Saudi Arabia.
Sorry, which one?
The National Industrial and Local Content Program. So this program, the core essence of the program is around stimulating sectors, industrial sector that will drive growth, local content, and exports. National Transformation Program is all about having a more efficient government, more agile government. Again, all our lenses in the privatization program is looking into these programs and trying not only to align, but participate also in the development and success of those programs.
Okay, so it's a parallel process, side by side with...
Definitely. Actually, the governance structure, if you look at the boards of these programs, it always try to include relevant ministers and relevant people who's interested in those programs. For example, in the privatization board, we do have a mix of legal experts, Ministry of Finance, subject matter experts, foreigners, you know, from around the world. We have technical experts, we have the pension funds. So all these entities are working around the insurance that the program is effective and taking place. Same story for all other programs. We also look with a very, very close eye around the sentiment of the global economies, what's going on around us in the region, what's going on around us in the global economies.
That's a very important question, isn't it? Where global markets are going, because that will determine your tactical timing.
Absolutely.
On share price sales. I notice all four of you are investment bankers by training and background. And I want to ask really how significant a role the investment banking profession plays in this whole process. Is it financial engineering, or is there real economic good that comes out of it? Bassem, let me ask you that first.
I think there's substantial contribution that is going to come out of it, in addition to funding, obviously, because we, as mentioned earlier, the privatization really looks at other factors other than funding. And I think even commercial banking has to address itself to adapt to the changes that are taking place in the economy in Saudi Arabia, if we are speaking about the Saudi example, in order to help with the balance sheets of banks to be leveraged against the transactions and against the opportunities that are going to exist in the next period. So I think there is a substantial contribution that will come out of financial institutions, the role of financial institutions, as presented by His Majesty. Capital markets have a lot to play in advancing privatization transactions coming in the pipeline over the next period. But I think also that you really need to make sure that the public participates in these opportunities.
Okay.
It is extremely important for public subscription to take place. When we speak about initial public offerings, it should not be limited only to institutions, hence the role of financial institutions in order to marshal, particularly on the retail side and commercial banking, in order to allow for private citizens, regardless of how small or large their savings are, to actually feel as real stakeholders in the ownership of the companies that are due to be privatized.
Okay, okay. Now, we're almost winding up, but I know that my journalistic colleagues in the hall would not forgive me if I didn't ask this next question, because we're here talking about privatizations, and the Saudi privatization program is the mother of all privatizations, it seems to me, but the mother of all privatizations is Saudi Aramco. And I would like to ask the Minister his view on the current status and where we might eventually see this.
So you couldn't resist, could you?
No, I couldn't. No, absolutely not. No. The journalist came out.
Well, I'll just say what His Royal Highness have said recently on his Bloomberg article, repeat what the Minister of Energy, Minister of Finance have said around that. So three things. One, in terms of readiness, the company is absolutely ready to the best global standard and the best listing venues in terms of financial statements, having an independent reserve. We have launched the hydrocarbon law, a new board in place, etc., etc. So all this effort has been made to make sure the company is IPO ready. Second, Aramco, as you know, had the growth strategy, especially in the downstream and petrochemicals, and the market is talking about a major acquisition of SABIC. And we do collectively think that in terms of this particular transaction and potentially others, Aramco is better off as a company for its shareholders. Three, I think back to the alignment and back to time of market and back to the global market pictures, oil market, etc. I think also the government have all the right in the world to time that IPO when it's optimal in terms of value and shareholders' benefits.
Okay, so 2021 looks achievable.
We're ready.
Yeah. Fellow panelists, many, many thanks. We have to wrap up now. Thank you very much to the audience for listening and indulging us. Thank you all. It's been a useful contribution to the debate we've had here at FII over the last 2 days. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.